Nazi spy, British spy. Why not both at the same time? This is the story of Eddie Chapman, known to British intelligence as Agent Zigzag, the criminal turned Nazi spy turned double agent whose extraordinary escapades make up one of the most intriguing stories of the Second World War. Eddie was born in Burnopfield in 1914. At 17, he joined the Coldstream Guards, where he had the honor of performing sentry duty outside the Tower of London. But after 9 months, Eddie went on leave and never came back, hanging out with a random girl he met in a club instead. He was then arrested after 2 months for going absent. He spent nearly 3 months in military prison and was then dishonorably discharged from the military. After this, he worked in a variety of positions: barman, film extra, dancer, masseuse, and wrestler. He also took up gambling and drinking, which quickly drained his finances. Time for crime. He picked up a series of fines, labor camp sentences, and just straight up prison. His crimes included burglary, fraud, and behaving in a manner likely to offend the public, aka sex in public. He also blackmailed people, specifically the women he wooed. Of course, this is all relatively small on the crime scale, but he was about to level up. He partnered up with the safecracker James Hunt, forming, with a couple others, the Jelly Gang. They used something called gelignite stuck to the safes with chewing gum to blow open the doors of safes and steal the contents. In one case, they broke into an empty house next door, cut through a wall, and then blew open the safes, which sounds vaguely like part of the plot in Muppets Most Wanted. They would even steal entire safes just to explode the doors off-site. After a failed getaway in Scotland, the gang were caught, but they were granted bail. Seems like a bad idea, to be honest. What money do you think they were using to pay for that? They fled to the Channel Islands, but police tracked them down. The rest of the gang was arrested, but not Chapman. When the police entered the restaurant they were sitting in, he dove through the window and took off running down the beach. However, he was turned in by the landlady at the boarding house where he tried to stay. But there would be another twist. In order to pay for the boarding house, he had broken into a nightclub, and that meant he would be tried on the island for burglary instead of being extradited back to the mainland. As a result, his sentence was a mere 2 years of hard labor on the island. And, because he soon befriended the governor, that hard labor quickly became weeding the garden and cleaning his house. When the governor left for vacation, Eddie proceeded to outfit himself in the governor's son's clothes, steal his wife's savings, and escape through the skylight. He then broke into a quarry, stealing detonators and 5 pounds of gelignite. After breaking into a house and enjoying a nice sleep, he headed to the beach. There, he was seized by 2 plainclothes police officers, but he managed to delay arrest by crying out that he was being assaulted, causing others at the beach to rush over to help him. However, he was still ultimately arrested, and another year was tacked onto his sentence. Then, the Second World War began. In 1940, the Channel Islands were bombed and occupied by Germany. Chapman was released in 1941, but Germany had no plans to send him back to England. He started working in a barber shop with a friend from prison. After a run-in with the German military police, after crashing his bike into a German motorcycle, he thought up a new idea: offer to work as a Nazi spy. That offer quickly resulted in an arrest by the Gestapo. Apparently, someone had been sabotaging German telephone wires, and the Jersey police had pointed out Chapman as the most likely culprit. He was sent to Romainville, the notorious Nazi prison in Paris. It was only then that his request was properly processed by the Nazi bureaucracy. He was interviewed several times before, in April of 1942, being released into the custody of German foreign intelligence. He was instructed in espionage, sabotage, and parachuting, and he was given the codename Fritz. Already an established blower-upper of things, they taught him even more ways to make bombs, and Chapman began to feel absorbed by his instructors at spy school, including his handler, a German aristocrat named Stefan von Groning, who was also a high-functioning alcoholic. What he didn't know is that they were all actually functioning under codenames, but what they didn't know was that he wasn't fully sold on becoming a German spy. Chapman wrote down the chemical formulas of bombs, he eavesdropped on his officers, and he took note of code words, all while they upgraded his name from Fritz to Fritzchen, the diminutive and affectionate form of the name. During his first real parachute jumps, Eddie's parachute failed to properly open, collapsing inward as he neared the ground. He smashed into the runway asphalt, his face the main point of contact. Several teeth were knocked out, and the Germans were forced to replace them for him. Shiny new gold teeth for the spy. He was even sent to Berlin to get further explosives training from a chemist. Actually, this story overlaps with one you might find more familiar, that of Bletchley Park, Alan Turing, and the Enigma machine, England's code-breaking team. They were aware of the new German spy training in France, and they knew he would be headed for Britain. Keeping tabs on the situation, they intercepted an incredible message. Dear France, Your friend Bobby the pig grows fatter every day. He is gorging now like a king, roars like a lion, and shits like an elephant. Fritz. This is just Fritz, or Eddie Chapman, who is simply reporting on the progress of his newly adopted pig, to the immense confusion of Britain's codebreakers. It was time for Eddie to come home. He would parachute into England with the goal of sabotaging the mosquito bomber factory in Hertfordshire. MI5 prepared to intercept him in Operation Nightcap, but they had the wrong area. When jumping out of the plane, his backpack got stuck. Because of the several seconds it took for the crew to kick him free, he ended up well outside of the drop zone, but that wouldn't stop them from catching him, mostly because Eddie proceeded to land, go to a local's house, knock on the door, and ask to phone the police. He then proceeded to eat their toast and drink their tea while he waited. He was ultimately taken to Camp 020, the secret interrogation camp for captured enemy spies, where he was interrogated by Lieutenant Colonel Tin-Eye Stevens, to whom he revealed everything. Frankly, it wasn't much of an interrogation since Chapman was happy to tell all and clearly wanted to work for Britain. He was recommended as the ideal candidate for a double-cross agent. A new codename was bestowed upon him, Agent Zigzag. He, under supervision of course, made contact with his German handlers, confirming his safe arrival. He'd been directed to make contact with his old Jelly Gang friends as potential helpers on his mission. This was easy for the British to accommodate since all of those guys were in prison. A random agent who looked vaguely like James Hunt could fill the role perfectly. Eddie was released to a safe house, under guard, but provided any comforts he wished. It was fine for a while, but not for long. Eddie Chapman, in case you haven't yet noticed, was a bit of an adrenaline seeker. He wanted to go back to France to spy on the Germans. The British decided to get him out of the house to assure the Germans of his reliability, and then hopefully give him back to the Germans. He scouted the mosquito factory, where a sabotage could be faked. And while the British were thinking about espionage, he crafted his own plan for what to do back on mainland Europe. His handlers had promised him attendance at a Nazi rally upon a successful return, and he had a great idea. He could assassinate Hitler. In another effort to placate his restlessness, MI5 allowed him to meet a former lover, Freda. She had discovered that she was pregnant shortly after Eddie disappeared to the Channel Islands. He had a daughter he'd never met. They met one night at a hotel, and she and their daughter then moved into the safe house. The operation was a success, calming him down. Well, as much as you can calm down Eddie Chapman. Back to the sabotage. As I've mentioned, the mosquito bombers were manufactured at the de Havilland aircraft factory. To actually blow it up would be a terrible idea, so a fake sabotage was planned. Through an incredible combination of paper mache, paint, soot, tarps, and dummy debris, the factory would be made to look as if Agent Fritz had succeeded in his mission. An accompanying fake story would be published in the papers, validating the scene. On this success, it was finally time to go abroad. It would be a long-term undercover mission in France. While Eddie requested pickup by submarine from his German handlers, they favored return through neutral Portugal. Of course, this was easier said than done. In order to manufacture a sense of urgency among the Germans, stories were planted about the arrest of James Hunt, who was really an MI5 agent and also not actually arrested. As an accomplice, this put Eddie in, fake of course, danger. Time to escape back to France. Still unable to convince the Germans to send a sub for him, he had to travel back via Portugal. He boarded a merchant ship to head off, using documents forged for him by MI5. On his way out, he stole his handler's gold-plated scissors. His shipping convoy was attacked during the trip, costing it 7 ships, but Chapman sailed on. Once he arrived, he offered the Germans to blow up the ship he arrived on, if they could just supply him 2 fake coal bombs. Don't worry though, he wasn't switching sides again, he was just obtaining sample explosives for the British. While MI5 dealt with that, Fritz, disguised as a Norwegian sailor, flew to Madrid. He went to France, then Berlin, being interrogated all the while. But he passed with flying colors. But one thing could still blow his cover: the lack of explosion on the city of Lancaster. That was soon taken care of. A fake investigation was staged, with explosives being found, and sailors were interrogated. They left to furnish the gossip mill with a story of how a Nazi agent had tried to blow up a British ship. Chapman was debated by German Secret Service leadership, but ultimately they deemed him a success. He was awarded 100,000 Reichsmarks, which is way less money than you think, and he was awarded the Iron Cross. He's the only British citizen to ever receive it, the highest symbol of bravery. He was given freedom in Oslo, and MI5 lost his trail. To the British, Agent Zigzag had disappeared. While in Norway, Eddie got a girlfriend named Dagmar. She thought he was a German agent, and she was in the Norwegian resistance. But because Eddie was a romantic idiot, he eventually revealed his identity to her. Remember, he didn't know she was in the resistance. Luckily, she was on board and even willing to help. taking photographs or other espionage things that could look benign. But the Nazis wanted to send him back to Britain. He was intended to discover and steal whatever the British were using to destroy Nazi U-boats. Sonar. This was an amazing opportunity. In order to provide him with the necessary information to complete the mission, Fritz got to learn the inner workings of the Germans' marine intelligence. Before he could leave, the Air Force intervened, wanting to send him on a mission for them to find out about British radar systems. Regardless, he was going back to Britain. His new code word used to decode his messages was decided: anti-church disestablishmentarianism, which is a hilarious choice. But he was running out of time. He got stuck in France and the Allies landed in Normandy. Hitler abolished German foreign intelligence, joining its operations into the Reich Security Office, which has a very long German name. He was finally assigned a new mission to be shipped out: assess and report on the damage caused by the German V-1 missiles. Of course, if he could do the radar and sonar things too, that would be much appreciated. He parachuted out over Cambridge, vomiting on the way down. He then face-planted on the road where he landed, knocking himself out. Still, he ultimately made it to a police station and back to MI5. He soon got to work providing disinformation about where the V-1 missiles were landing. This would cause the Nazis to adjust their aim, making them more likely to miss targets, or miss even worse than they were. He would also send weather reports, since he didn't really have an excuse not to do that. His impact is unclear, but German bombs kept missing their targets, possibly due to his false intelligence. MI5 also had his criminal record wiped, but they didn't tell him. Don't want to give him any ideas. If he was a bit worried about the police, maybe he'd listen a little better. Chapman also provided the Germans about a new British submarine bomb, which did exist, but wasn't really doing what the Germans thought it was. It was the decoding of German messages that was actually hurting their U-boats. But problems were bubbling up. Chapman's case officer was dispatched to France, and his replacement immediately hated Chapman. And to be fair, Chapman also hated him. In fact, his new case officer wanted him kicked out of British intelligence. And to be fair to this guy, named Michael Ride, Eddie wasn't exactly well behaved. He started making money by betting on fixed dog races and other sketchy activities. Then, the axe came down. Jimmy Hunt, Chapman's old accomplice, had been released from prison. He came to party with Chapman, who divulged his secret employment to him. Chapman signed the Official Secrets Act and was promptly fired. Effectively, he was now legally bound to not say anything, or he'd be put away in prison. Of course, this was all at Ride's doing. Eddie immediately went back to crime, freed from any obligations. His life continued on the same track it was on previously. In the 1950s, he participated in a plot to smuggle cigarettes around Morocco and also to kidnap the Sultan, which failed miserably. He would appear in court somewhat regularly, but continually got off by providing character references from high-up officials. Crime certainly paid, since he made enough money to buy a castle in Ireland. He repeatedly attempted to publish his stories, but only managed to release a sanitized version that omitted all details about his work with MI5. He also managed to remain friends with his German handler for the rest of his life, who even came to his daughter's wedding. That first conversation probably was pretty awkward. Anyway, that is the story of Eddie Chapman. Thank you for listening. I appreciate the support, and I'll see you again soon.